Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar for the OceanICU program. My name is Richard Sanders and I work in NORSE, which is a research organisation in Norway. What we're planning to do in this seminar is just give you a flavour of this project that deals with the ocean carbon cycle. Over the next 3 to 4 years, we're planning to run one of these seminars approximately every other month on different aspects of it. So this is just a general introduction. Next slide, please. So the way that we're running this one today is that we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion. But first, we have various people from different stages of the project who are going to give a little soundbite or a little flavour of the work that they're doing or the work package that they're involved in. So Andy Watson is going to talk a little bit about the role of the project in the global carbon cycle. Carla Freitas is going to talk a little bit about some of the specific work we're doing on one class of organism. Morten's going to talk a little bit about numerical modelling and how that integrates in. And finally, Pernille is going to give a little overview of how we're connecting some of the work we're doing to end users and society. So next slide, please. So just a few domestic details. So we're going to give a few slides each. Then we're hoping to have a bit of a discussion. You're welcome to send questions in. On the right-hand side, you can see the address at the bottom. Please just pop them in an email. We have somebody to field them. And then if we don't manage to take your question, we will respond to them later. We're recording this webinar, so that's for your information. And we've disabled cameras and microphones so that we can kind of focus on the main message. So as I say, just pop your question into an email. And if you want to be anonymous, then that's fine. And we'll try and respond to everything over the next couple of days. So next slide, please, Peter. So this slide just sort of sets up the problem. We all know that climate change is a huge issue that we face collectively. And fundamentally, it's driven by the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in response to that very, very large change in our lives that we have to cope with, we have a raft of policies, including something known as the Green Deal, which requires us to move to operating in a carbon neutral way. And what that means is that every sector of society has to think through how it's going to modify its activities to reduce its carbon footprint. And ocean users are no different to anybody else in that regard. So we need to think about how to compensate for direct effects. So, for example, greenhouse gas production by shipping, but also indirect effects. So things that we do in the ocean and how they alter the ocean carbon cycle, which might have profound impacts on what the ocean does with carbon. So the sorts of questions we're asking are, how big are these indirect effects? How do they operate? And what can we do to reduce or minimize them? And then ultimately, next slide, please. Ultimately, we want to then take that information and turn it into useful tools so that people have an ability to think through and quantitatively try to understand what the consequences of their actions are. So our general strategy to deliver that ambitious goal is to firstly try and define the current state of the carbon cycle. What does it look like now? Secondly, to quantify all of the key processes that are relevant, or some of the key processes that are relevant, and then take those key processes and put them into numerical models so that we can evaluate their significance. Then we plan to build new tools to support decision making, and then couple these to future scenarios of what we believe key industrial sectors will do with the ocean going forward. So fishing and industrial processes. Next slide. And then ultimately, all of this information is only really useful if we manage to connect it properly to end users. So we have a raft of groups that we're hoping to talk to transfer information to, and we're putting a lot of effort into thinking about what sort of style of information they need and how to empower people to take action themselves. So that's the sort of background to the project, and this is a bit of a structural overview, a wiring diagram, if you like, of how it's going to work. And what we're planning to do in this seminar is take what I call a diagonal slice through that. So just give you a few highlights of different levels or different stages in that project, so that you can get a feel for how the project works, the sorts of things it's doing, so that hopefully if you come back for another seminar in the future, you have some background about how the whole thing works that the details can slot into. So I'm going to hand over now to Andy Watson, who's going to just say a little bit about what we plan to do around understanding the global carbon sink in the oceans.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for the introduction. The way that the project is structured is that the sort of first stage of our investigations is in what we call work package 2. Work package 1 is, administration and management. Work package 2 is we want to define the current state of the ocean carbon cycle. So basically, what do we know now or think we know? And this can provide a baseline for the other work packages in the project. So in particular, we're focusing on what we know about how much of the carbon dioxide which humans emit to the atmosphere is taken up by the ocean, and how this has varied in past decades, and how much we expect it to change in the future. But we also want to ask the question what we know about what mechanisms are causing the ocean to take up carbon, how much is biology in particular, and how much is physics. And then we are looking at what we know currently about how direct human activities might be affecting that. So things like fishing, both in the coastal oceans and the deep sea, and deep sea mining, offshore carbon sequestration. Not much of this is occurring yet, but some people would like much more of it to occur. So how much would that affect the current state of the ocean carbon cycle? Next slide, please. Just where does all the carbon dioxide go that we emit? We've put about 10 billion tons of carbon, that's just the carbon bit that we're counting there, into the atmosphere every year. That's about 44 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And between a quarter and a third of this roughly is being absorbed by the oceans. Somewhere comparable amount is being absorbed by the land. The rest is staying in the atmosphere. So the oceans are currently doing us a great service by slowing the rate of climate change, because they take up some of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So we want to know more accurately the ocean uptake. Is it a quarter? Is it a third? We also want to know, what's causing that. There are problems here because different observational methods disagree on exactly how much, and they'd also disagree with our best models of what we think should be happening, as it were. Next slide. So this is this graph was been recently published by the Global Carbon Project, and it's there. The Global Carbon Project every year publishes a sort of annual inventory of where they think carbon has gone, and both in the past and for the present year. So their models represent the best synthesis of what we think we know, and that's the black line on this graph. The observational estimates made by looking at surface carbon measurements are the average of those is the blue line, and you can see they disagree, and the disagreement is getting bigger as we go through. So this graph goes from the 60s up until 2021, but that discrepancy is getting bigger. So that's a worry. It means that our best models, which represent our best understanding, are either they're wrong or the observations are wrong. Something's wrong. Next slide, please. The ocean observations are made, there are thousands of scientists who contribute towards these, and they put their observations into surface observations into something called SOCAT, the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas, and their observations at depth into something called GLODAP, which has full depth observations. And these are the basis for our observational estimates. Next slide, please. What we want to do in Work Package 2 and are beginning to do is firstly to review and summarize the existing ocean-based observational methods. I've shown you some of them, and we want to compare them with independent methods. In particular, we can use atmospheric oxygen observations, which have been made since 1990. To separate, we can use those to get at the ocean uptake, because we can separate the what is being taken up by the land surfaces from what is taken up by the oceans, if we look at the change that we are observing in atmospheric oxygen. Measuring atmospheric oxygen at this level, at the part per million level, is very difficult to do, but there are a few groups around the world that can do it. We also are developing new ocean inversion techniques. These are methods which use the ocean data, but in new ways, to try to get semi-independent estimates of how much carbon dioxide is going into the oceans. Finally, what we want to do is to synthesize a best estimate and our current uncertainty on that best estimate. Next slide, please. We also want to look at what is biological and what is physical in the processes of carbon dioxide uptake. As I mentioned, there seems to be some problems with a current generation of models. Those models, while we know that biological processes are very important in setting the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere and how much CO2 goes into the oceans, most of the models being used to inform policy tend to assume that that's a steady state, that there's no real change in the biological fluxes. Whether that's right or not, I think we will be going back to that question in Work Package 2. Next slide, please. We also want to look at what we currently know about the direct effect of human activities in the oceans. And that, at the present time, would be probably mostly our fishing activities. We know that we have a substantial effect on the top predators in the ocean from fishing pressure. How much that actually affects the carbon cycle in its other at the other trophic levels down to the plankton is less well known, and we want to look into that. So, of course, we also want to look at the possible impact of new activities in the ocean, such as deep sea mining, such as ocean carbon sequestration in the ocean seabed. So I think that's my last slide. So I'll hand over to Carla, who's going to tell you about whales and carbon fluxes.
Thank you. So I work at the Institute of Marine Research in Norway, and together with my colleagues, I'm studying the contribution of whales to the biologic carbon pump. This is part of the Work Package 4 of the project that is looking at the biologic carbon pump in general and the contribution of the different organisms, from microorganisms to top predators, their contribution to the biologic carbon pump. So why whales? Next slide, please. So whales are part of the carbon cycle, like us humans, actually. They consume carbon, they respirate carbon, they accumulate carbon that eventually sinks to the sea bottom, and they excrete carbon. But one thing that is special with whales, and the next slide, please, is that their poo is not only big, but it spreads in seawater and apparently dissolves immediately. And several studies have found that these fecal plumes are rich in nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron that are important for phytoplankton. And therefore, it has been suggested that excretions may stimulate primary production and in this way contribute to some uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. And this mechanism, which is illustrated in this upper part of the figure, is called the whale pump and makes a lot of sense. But what we don't know is the amount of nutrients that are excreted by the different whale populations and what is their impact on primary production. And this is one of the carbon fluxes that we are going to quantify here in OceanICU. In addition, we are going to quantify the amount of carbon that sinks every year through whale deadfalls and also the carbon that sinks through fecal pellets, which is the part of the whale plumes that sink as particles. Our next slide, please. Our first study species is the minke whale, is the most common species in our study area. And our study area includes the Nordic seas. You see here Norway and UK. And our study area includes the North Sea, Norwegian Sea, Greenland Sea, and Barents Sea. And all these polygons you see in the map are areas where we have abundance estimates for minke whales and for other whale species, which is an important parameter in this, to be able to quantify these fluxes. The first thing we need to know when quantifying the whale pump is how much nutrients are excreted by these whales. And we have published this year the first estimates for Svalbard, this archipelago north of Norway. Next slide, please. And for this area, we quantified the amount of poo excreted by minke whales. There's around 15,000 minke whales using this area during summer, and they all together are expected to excrete 600 tons of poo each single day. And in this paper, we report the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients excreted by these whales. One thing we found in this study was that minke whales excrete more phosphorus than nitrogen, and this was not expected because phytoplankton need more nitrogen than phosphorus for primary production, on average 16 times more nitrogen than phosphorus. So it means that there's in a way a lack of nitrogen in minke whale feces, and it is probable or likely that the remaining lack in nitrogen is excreted through urine, but this is something that we need to quantify. And the other thing we did was a rough estimate of how much primary production could be produced based on the phosphorus excreted by these whales, and we came to a rough estimate around 0.2 to 4% of the daily primary production in this area. But this is assuming that there is enough of nitrogen being released to urine or available in the environment, and assuming that all this phosphorus is utilized by phytoplankton, and this might not be the case. So next slide, please. So there's a lot of questions that need to be still need to be quantified. For example, what is the concentration of nutrients on the feces of the whales, depending on what they have eaten, depending on the season of the year, and depending on the whale species? What is the amount of nutrients, especially nitrogen, on the urine? And how does phytoplankton respond to these whale nutrients? And what is the amount of nutrients that instead of being utilized by phytoplankton, what is the proportion that sinks instead as particles to the seafloor? So a lot of questions still that we will still need to answer, and that will be investigated here in OceanICU. And one important question is also, where do these whales eat? Because if whales acquire their prey in surface waters, when they are excreting in surface waters, they are just recycling nutrients that were already in the photic zone, while if they are consuming their prey in deep waters, they are injecting new nutrients to surface waters. So that's therefore, in OceanICU, we started tagging whales with depth sensors because we didn't have data on the foraging depths. So once we have estimated all these parameters and quantified these carbon fluxes, both from the whale pump, from fecal pellets, and from deadfalls, we will transfer all this data to the carbon models to the work package 6 in this project to investigate what is the impact of these whale fluxes on the general carbon cycling. And that's why Morten will talk about now.
Okay, thank you. Given that we know how much extra nutrients are coming from the whale excretion, the next step will then be to calculate the effect of these sources, and as said, primarily on the effect on primary production. Next, please. Primary production, or phytoplankton growth, can be considered as the amount of marine grass that is produced through photosynthesis. Or simplified, the photosynthesis takes energy from the sun and builds phytoplankton by utilizing the available nutrients in the water. And this is dependent on several factors, but in the end, the amount of phytoplankton produced is limited by the available nutrients. And climate, through the physical processes in the water, have a major impact on this. First, the wind. It's important as it decides the vertical mixing, which again determines the amount of nutrients that is available in the upper mixed layer. Second is the temperature. It's also an important regulating factor for stratification, but also on the metabolic rates and how large the regenerated production becomes. It might also have an impact on the species composition, which is not something that we are going to consider here, but that's also a factor of vital importance for the transfer of energy up the food chain. And finally, the third process you're focusing on here is the light, and through the cloud cover, that has an effect on the production rates, but also on how deep the light penetrates down into the water, which again decides the volume on where primary production takes place. And the total effect from climate is kind of balancing all these effects through a number of non-linear processes. So the total impact is not necessarily clear. Next, please. Here's an example of an expert opinion from the 5th IPCC report. And this is for high latitude spring bloom systems, where the experts have considered the effect of temperature on regenerated production as the most important. And from that project, that there will be an increase in the primary production. Next, please. As said, the whales will also contribute to the primary production through their excretion in the upper mixed layer. That will again depend on the physical condition, as I said, wind, light, and temperature. And taking all this into account, what we aim for is to quantify the impact of the whales on the phytoplankton growth in both space and time. And to do this, we will use an ecosystem model. Next, please. The model I will be using is the Norwecom end-to-end model, which is a collection of submodels built into one frame. One of these is a module for plankton production. But depending on the results from this module, we also have the opportunity to include both zooplankton and fish to assess the impact of whale excretion also to higher trophic layers. Next, please. And this is where we are now. We will perform 2 sets of simulations, one with and one without extra nutrients from the whales, and then compare the simulated primary production. By doing this, it will be possible to isolate the effects of whale excretion and then assess its impact on the carbon cycling. Next speaker.
No, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I am, just a brief introduction. I am a senior researcher at WMU, which is World Maritime University in Sweden. I am going to talk about something that is completely different from what we have just heard. I have a background also in politics, and I was a member of the Danish Parliament negotiating agreements there, and also a member of the Nordic Council and the Interparliamentary Union. I am going to talk about the roadmap to impact and science to policy. Together with my, next slide please, together with work package lead Professor Mary Wise and my colleague Michaela Gomez, I've just completed and handed in a risk assessment protocol for the Mission Atlantic, which is also a EU Horizon 2020 project. In this study, we have examined the discourses surrounding ocean science diplomacy and its role in the integrated ecosystem assessment process from the perspective of marine scientists, policy advisors, civil servants, and policy decision makers from the global south and the global north. Next, please. Our team at the WMU, we are part of the work package 8 in OceanICU, and part of our assignment is to make a policy analysis on the policies that protect and enhance the biological carbon pump. And also we are going to do a qualitative study on the decision-making process. There's no doubt that integration of science in policy is still not sufficient. And as the Deputy Minister, Jan Dušek, his name is, from the Czech Republic, said after the COP27, he said that despite of being informed by the IPCC reports, parties still haven't taken the necessary steps to, for instance, phase out fossil fuels globally. And I will claim that one of the reasons for this is that we still are looking at a very simplistic and linear model of science to policy. Next, please. And a lot of evidence is, in fact, fed into policy processes by science, but the necessary decisions are still not made. And there's no doubt that there is a science to policy disconnect. We have to assess what are the scientific barriers, what is it that prevents the identification of policy levels, and the plans of action adopted or pursued by governments and parties to take transformative action. One of the answers is improving the science policy interfaces. Next, please. If anyone doubt that there's a strong focus on this more simplistic linear science to policy model and process, where policymakers are seen as keen to utilize science expertise to produce effective policies, then one might just look at the enormous amount of policy briefs that are produced around the world. Next, please. Science to policy interfaces today are expected to go beyond this linear model. through creating spaces for exchange and dialogue between policy and knowledge. And most environmental issues require inter- and transdisciplinary approaches. In order to understand what goes wrong in the process, we will look at these three contexts, which are shown here: the science, the COPs and forums, the decision-making forums, and the agreements and the conventions and the policy. Thank you. Next, please. Our team will do, as I mentioned before, a desk-based analysis of the policies, agreements, and conventions that are relevant for the ocean carbon pump. And we will ask questions such as, are the outcomes of negotiations and agreements good enough for the ocean and for the carbon pump? Next, please. The issues for which scientific input is most needed by policymakers are the issues for which science is often most complex and multidisciplinary and incomplete, which is a barrier. Another barrier is that there is no agreed way of tracking impact on policy, research impact on policy. Next, please. In order to look at the roadmap to impact, we will have to rethink models of policy impact. Providing scientific advice to governments take place within an ecosystem. It is a combination of actors who are both internal and external to government, and also with advice that is both formal and informal. In this model here, that was too early. In this model, I have touched upon the first one in the top, which I mentioned is probably too simplistic. The second model is showing how research is constantly being influenced by policy, that political power is also shaping knowledge. And I will now have a quick look at the third and the fourth. Next, please. This is the co-production model. The model requires quite resource-intensive methodologies. At the moment, there's a capacity issue. There's not enough or sufficient resource being available because it also requires expertise around or across disciplines. And also we see in our latest study that there's not enough buy-in to such models and methodologies from natural science disciplines. Next, please. This is a model that is, the cultural gap model is a system theoretic approach based on Luhmann. In this model, we see science and policy as two different cultures where science operates and science is concerned with establishing truth claims, and the political system is, on the other hand, concerned with making binding decisions. And from each side, they see the other as a black box. And looking from this perspective, we need to try as scientists to see this perspective of politics and make sense of how and why the political system picks up some data, methods, and techniques from science. Next, please. I guess we can all agree that policy is messy, and it is messy because the world is messy, and scientific evidence is only one of many inputs in the policy-making process. Policy-making is influenced by election cycles, citizen demand, lobbyism, and political goals of various sorts. In my personal experience, research is also being cherry-picked by political parties and even states for tactical reasons. Ultimately, it is up to us as scientists and as researchers to continue to reflect and exchange on how we might best work together to improve our collective understanding of these multidimensional and multi-scalar problems, and in doing so, to better inform all kinds of decision making. Thank you.
So thanks, Pernille, and thanks to all the speakers. I really enjoyed that sort of slice through the project, looking at different people doing different things, and the chain of activities that takes place, leading from people making observations at sea through to helping people make decisions around managing ocean activities. So I'm not sure if we've got any questions coming in, but I'll take a look. The first area where I think it would be really interesting to have a discussion is around the whale activities. And one of our panelists has asked, one of the audience has asked questions around how do you couple the observations of vertical movement of whales to understanding of where they kind of like do different things at different times of the day? So could you just say a few words about that, maybe, Carla?
Yes, the whales, they need to come to the surface to breathe all the time, well, regularly. So their vertical movements is different from fish that normally they are in deeper waters during the day and then come at night to the surface, or the opposite. So from the satellite tags, you can see which water layers they are spending more time and what is their diving activity, and then try to infer from that where they are feeding and getting their food. That means where they are acquiring the nutrients that will be released in surface waters.
So that's a really interesting answer. I mean, I guess I've got a follow-up here, which is, Morten, how do you take that information, of really complicated information about what a whale does, and kind of put that into a, of necessity, really simple model?
Yes, I get the data for the excretion, which I just consider as a source, like other sources. I mean, in the model we have nutrients from rivers, we have nutrients from the atmosphere, and we will have nutrients from the whales. So you basically add extra nutrients in the area and at the depth and at the time where we know there are whales, and then the model will just include that in its budget of calculating the primary production. So it's not that. So it's not something new. It's just an extra source of nutrients that we have to take into consideration.
Okay. So a nutrient from a whale is just the same as a nutrient from a river.
Yeah, basically. I mean, if seen from the model, it's just the same. It's just placed another place.
Okay. Just comes in a different place. Okay. So we're also getting some questions around linking all this information through to policy, which is something that we're all very keen to do. Pernille, I think Andy showed quite clearly that there's really good scientific evidence around where carbon that we put into the atmosphere goes, and we're all aware of the extreme weather patterns that are happening somewhere. But as you pointed out, it's challenging to kind of implement policies to deal with that. So what in your view is the roadblock that kind of stops us doing that? Are we still operating in silos, or is there some way to kind of cut through that complicated ecosystem of activities that you showed?
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons is that politicians in most democracies are just normal people. They are smart, but not experts. So I think attempting to translate something in a policy brief is just not enough. We need to see it, like I said, I tried to explain with these models, we need to see the whole ecosystem of what is going on, because there's a lot of things going on in the policy decision-making process. We can't expect that when they have the same data as you and as we have in this project, they will just act on it. And I think it's obvious to everyone. I also noticed that it was mentioned in Andrew's slides that there's a disagreement. That is not something that is good for the policy process as well, because then the disagreement can be used, to battle between different political agendas somehow. So I think that it has to do with the last slide I showed, that you could call it the bubble, the different cultural spheres, and the difficulty in and seeing the other one as a black box and not really knowing on which level the explanation should be. Is it on a very scientific level, or how should it be communicated to the policy decision makers? There's a lot of barriers, and we have listed some of them in the last project that we did. There's also, like I said, the political influence on the scientific negotiations. There's a lot of different aspects that needs to be looked at in order to try to solve this disconnect there is between science and policy.
Thanks, Pernille. That's really interesting perspective. And it kind of makes me wonder, Andy, whether we put enough effort into kind of these large-scale integrations and resolving differences in estimates compared to, for example, acquiring basic data. Where should we put our emphasis as a kind of observing and modelling community?
I think that I completely take the point that it doesn't help usually when you're talking to a policymaker, engaging with policymakers, if you say, well, we don't actually know how much carbon dioxide going into the ocean. But on the other hand, that is the case at the moment, and of course scientists are really drawn to those unknown areas. They're the most exciting and interesting to work in. As we should be working hard to remove that uncertainty, and I think that both would include a more imaginative, I might say, modeling effort, because at the moment most of our models, most of the models which are actually used, for example, for the IPCC, they're actually pretty broadly similar in their structures. So I don't see too many people, as it were, thinking outside the box there. But I'm afraid the other thing that we really need to do is improve our data collection and to improve the observations, because we don't actually know at this point in time how much of that discrepancy between observations and models is because the models are wrong, and how much of it is because there's just not sufficient observations to tie down the issue. So both of those aspects really have to be improved, and it would be great to be able to say to policymakers, we need to improve this aspect of the models, and we need to improve this aspect of the observations, and help within from Europe would be much appreciated.
So that's a really interesting answer. As always, it's a bit of everything. But can I just pick out one thing you said, which was that we need to think outside the box, and not enough people do. Can you just give us one out of the box thought to take away before we kind of wrap it up?
Well, I would say that we should be looking at this is not that out of the box, really, as far as modelers are concerned. We need much higher resolution models, which more accurately give us the model the true physics, as it were, of the ocean and the true biology of the ocean. That means you need bigger computers, I'm afraid, and you need to run them for longer. And that's the reason, of course, why that tends not to be the case in the IPCC. But some big computers would be really useful.
Okay, so that's a nice take-home message for us all to bear in mind. So I think we're going to wrap this up in the next few minutes so that we can all kind of go and get on with our afternoon jobs. If you're in Europe, that is. Hopefully, there's some people that have joined from across the globe, and if so, then welcome, and it's lovely to see you, or to have you in the audience. Before we close, though, I'd just like to ask all the panelists if they've got one sort of closing statement that they'd like to make, one thing to bear in mind, and then after that we'll go on and kind of like I'll just tell you a little bit about the next seminar, what it's about, and how to join. So, have any of the panelists just got one final message for the audience?
Yeah. Who's first?
You are.
Okay, I have one really urgent issue, and that is that it's very important to include social science from the beginning of every natural science project in order to make sure that this is communicated in the right way and that policymakers and others are included also in the process. So that is my strongest point, I would say, with this.
Thanks, Pernille.
Relating to the whales and carbon, I think one important thing to have in mind is that independently how big is the impact of whales on carbon cycling can be big impact or low impact, but most important is to have robust estimates of their contribution to carbon cycling, because that's something that has been a lot of uncertainty and a lot of a lot of uncertainty and no, I lost the word. A lot of speculations about that. So it's very important to clarify with good science what is the contribution of whales to carbon cycling and their role in marine ecosystems in general.
Okay, thanks, Carla. And any other final thoughts before we move on to the next seminar?
What I would say is that I think that this project is very important because our future projections, which are being delivered to policymakers via the IPCC, for example, we in a sense know that they're wrong. We already know that they're wrong, and we really do need to get those better. Then so that we have more certainty in what might be happening for a given emission scenario 20, 30, 50 years in the future. So this project is hopefully helping to get the carbon part of that of those Earth system models right.
Thanks, and I think that's something we can all sign up to for this. So maybe we could just have a quick advert, Peter, for the next seminar. So the next seminar in the series is going to kind of deep dive into one specific aspect of the project, and that's around the role that fish play in the global carbon cycle. So this is a really exciting topic that lots of people are working on. And the Marine Institute in Ireland is going to host a seminar, bit of discussion, bit of open conversation, a few presentations. It's on the 23rd of November, and there's a QR code that you can scan. But if you go to our website, you can find details, and it would be great to see you there. Thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to your continual engagement. We do have a newsletter that you can sign up for. You can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I think we might even be on Instagram now. So it's been great to see you, and thanks for attending. And thanks for the applause from somebody.